At my own $1,500,000 wedding in Napa Valley, I watched my mother-in-law tear my mom apart with a single sentence in front of 204 people. Stephanie gestured to my mother and whispered to a guest, "That is not a mother, that is a mistake in a dress." My fiancé, Connor, laughed along. I did not. I stood up, pushed my chair back, and ended the wedding before the cake was even cut. Marrying into this family was the only mistake here, not my mother. Have you ever seen someone's true face at the exact moment you were about to give them your whole life? Drop a comment and let me know your story. I'd also love to know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The sound of 204 people gasping at once was enough of a soundtrack for my exit. I took my mother's hand. Her skin was rough, a map of 40 years of hard work. And in that moment, those calluses felt more valuable than the 10-carat diamond ring I had just left sitting on a linen napkin. I led her down the marble steps of the estate, past the rows of white roses that had cost more than her first car. Connor didn't follow me. None of them did. They were too busy managing the optics of a collapsed $1.5 million spectacle. But they made a mistake. They thought the wedding was the only thing I was canceling. We reached my car. I didn't wait for a valet. I didn't care about the deposited luggage or the honeymoon tickets to the Maldives sitting in the glove box. I just needed to be away from the smell of expensive perfume and hypocrisy. I started the engine and watched the Napa Valley sunset bleed into the horizon. My mother sat in the passenger seat, staring at her hands. "Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the tires. "You shouldn't have. Your career. His family. They are powerful people." "My career is fine, Mom," I said, my voice steady. "And they aren't a family, they are a liability." I reached into the back seat for my laptop. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel a breakdown coming. What I felt was clarity, cold, clinical clarity. This wasn't a tragedy, it was a balance sheet. And it was time to settle the accounts. You see, the Vanguard family thought they owned me. They thought because they were paying my salary as the lead creative director, they owned my mind and my designs. But I wasn't just an employee, I was a smart one. I had signed on as an independent creative contractor. My contract had a very specific clause, an immediate termination, right for any breach of professional ethics or personal harassment. Calling my mother a mistake in a dress was more than enough. I opened my laptop. The screen glowed, illuminating the interior of the car with a pale blue light. I pulled up the Vanguard fashion production server. For the past 2 years, I had built their entire infrastructure around my proprietary encryption methods. I owned the private keys to the designs for the entire upcoming spring and summer collections. Without those keys, their digital patterns were just useless strings of code. Their manufacturing plants in 3 different countries would grind to a halt within the hour. No new samples, no production lines, no revenue. I hovered my cursor over the revoke button. I thought about Stephanie's smirk. I thought about Connor's laughter. My compassion for them had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years. Now, the subscription was over. I clicked. 128 files vanished from their active server and moved into my personal encrypted cloud. At exactly 11:59 p.m., the Vanguard empire effectively stopped producing fashion. I shut the laptop. "Let's go home, Mom," I said. The digital severance was complete. The financial reckoning was just beginning. I watched my mother's chest rise and fall in the passenger seat. She was still wearing that ivory lace dress, the one she had stayed up until 3 a.m. the night before to finish, her eyes straining under a single desk lamp. I looked at her hands again. They weren't just rough, they were covered in a constellation of tiny red marks, thousand-fold evidence of every time the needle had slipped during those late nights when she worked herself to the bone to keep us afloat. Richard Vanguard and his wife didn't see those marks. They only saw a woman who didn't know which fork to use. They didn't see the woman who had effectively built their spring collection with her own hands because their couture designers couldn't replicate the intricate embroidery she'd perfected over 30 years. For 2 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. I had been the one who fixed the holes in their production schedules, the one who turned Richard's sloppy sketches into global trends. I had stayed silent while they treated my mother like a ghost in the hallway of their estate. People often ask why victims stay, why I let them diminish me for so long. It's because of the invisible chains. When you spend your life as a survivor, your brain creates a prison without bars. You tell yourself that if you just work harder, if you just become enough, they will finally see you. You mistake their permission to exist for a seat at the table. But I wasn't just working. I was waiting. I was waiting for the exact moment when their arrogance would exceed their bank balance. Richard thought he had buried my father 30 years ago. He thought when he pushed my dad out of their original partnership and let him die with nothing but a drawer full of broken promises that the story was over. He didn't know my father had established a secret trust fund, one that Richard's lawyers had missed during the bankruptcy. It wasn't just a small nest egg. With interest and strategic investments I had managed in the dark, that fund had grown to $22 million. That was my war chest. I hadn't spent a single cent of it on myself. I lived in a studio and ate ramen while I watched the Vanguards bleed cash to maintain their Vanguard legacy image. I knew Richard was overleveraged. I knew Connor's gambling debts were being shuffled between shell accounts. And I knew that this $1,500,000 wedding in Napa was the final straw for their liquidity. They had spent every last bit of their available cash on white gazebo roses and documentary crews to prove to the world how perfect they were. They thought they were buying a fairy tale. In reality, they were buying me the leverage I needed to own them. I pulled the car into our driveway and looked at my phone. The notification from my brokerage account was there. Over the last 8 months, I had used that $22 million to quietly buy up 60% of the voting shares from disgruntled minority shareholders who were tired of Richard's vanity projects. Richard thought he was my boss. Stephanie thought she was my social superior. Connor thought he was my husband. They were all wrong. As of 12 midnight, I was the majority owner of Vanguard Fashion. This wasn't a family drama anymore, it was an audit. And tomorrow morning, I was going to collect every single cent they owed my father's ghost. The sun didn't even have a chance to clear the San Francisco skyline before the vultures started circling. I sat in my small kitchen, the silence of the morning punctuated only by the relentless vibration of my phone on the wooden table. It wasn't just messages anymore. It was notifications from news sites and social media tags. Richard and Stephanie had spent the night working not on an apology, but on a narrative. The first headline I saw was in a local lifestyle blog. Vanguard fashion scandal, lead designer suffers psychotic break at altar. The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. It described me as emotionally unstable, a woman who had crumbled under the sophisticated pressure of joining one of the city's most elite families. They painted my mother as a tragic figure I was using as a shield to hide my own insecurities. Then came the text from Stephanie. I didn't even have her name saved anymore, but I knew the area code. It read, "You are a pathetic, small-minded girl, Grace. Your mother's presence made our carpets feel like a discount warehouse, and your little stunt yesterday has only proven that you will never be more than a common thimble pusher. You will never work in this industry again." I read it and felt nothing. No, that's not right. I felt fascinated. I was looking at the trap of normalized cruelty in real time. To people like Stephanie, this wasn't being mean. It was simply maintaining the natural order. In her mind, she wasn't a bully. She was an architect, protecting her masterpiece from a flaw. This is how the vultures operate. They normalize their cruelty until it feels like a civic duty. They have to dehumanize my mother, turning her into a mistake or a stain. Because if they acknowledged her as a human who has sacrificed 40 years of her life, their entire world of unearned privilege would collapse under its own weight. It's a psychological cage. They believe that status is a moral compass. Because they have more, they must be better. And because they are better, any act of cruelty against those they deem beneath them is just an administrative correction. But while Stephanie was busy typing insults about my mother's unrefined hands, Richard was busy with a different kind of paperwork. My laptop was still open from the night before, and I was watching the public filings for the Napa Valley estate. Richard thought he was the only one who could play with numbers. He didn't know I could see the truth behind the Vanguard facade. To pay for Connor's debts and this $1,500,000 wedding, Richard had just signed a high-interest bridge loan. He had effectively mortgaged the very villa we had walked out of yesterday. They were standing on the edge of a financial cliff, shouting at me about my social standing. They were vultures masquerading as eagles, too arrogant to realize that the ground beneath them had already turned to sand. I didn't respond to Stephanie's text. I didn't defend my mother. I didn't need to. I just went back to my spreadsheet. The hostile takeover was no longer a plan, it was an inevitability. The lobby of the Vanguard Tower felt different this morning. The air conditioning was humming at its usual 68 degrees, but the atmosphere was thick with a tension that didn't appear on any thermostat. The minority shareholders were already gathered in the executive conference room on the 45th floor. These were the people who had invested their life savings and retirement funds into Richard Vanguard's legacy. And right now, they were watching that legacy burn in real time on every social media feed in the country. I could hear Richard's voice before I even reached the heavy glass doors. He was at the head of the table, his face a mask of sweating arrogance, trying to maintain a control that had already slipped through his fingers. "The scandal is temporary," he was shouting, his voice cracking with a desperation. He tried to hide behind a practiced baritone. "Grace is just a girl having a tantrum. We will replace her. The stock will recover. We are the Vanguards." I pushed the doors open. I wasn't wearing a bridal gown or a submissive smile. I was wearing a charcoal suit I had bought with my very first independent design commission. I didn't look like the common thimble pusher Stephanie had described in her text. I looked like the person who was about to turn their ivory tower into a memory. The room went silent. Richard stood up so quickly his chair hit the mahogany wall with a dull thud. "You have some nerve showing up here, Grace. Security is already on their way. You are fired effective immediately. You will never set foot in this building again." "You can't fire me, Richard," I said, walking to the empty seat directly across from him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "You don't have the voting power to fire a janitor in this building, let alone me." I pulled a stack of notarized documents from my briefcase. I didn't throw them. I placed them on the table with clinical precision. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. For the last 8 months, while you were busy over-leveraging this company to pay for Connor's gambling habits and a $1,500,000 wedding you couldn't afford, I've been buying, informed me. The shareholders leaned in, their eyes scanning the documents. Mr. Thompson, the oldest member of the board, squinted at the top page. "This is a transfer of voting rights from the Miller and Chen funds and the employee retirement blocks?" "Correct," I said. "Combined with the Hale Trust, I now control 60% of Vanguard Fashion's voting shares. I am the majority owner." Richard's face went from a furious red to a sickly, translucent gray. He looked at the papers, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Where did you get that kind of money? That's impossible." "I got it from the man you thought you erased 30 years ago," I said, leaning forward until I could see the sweat on his forehead. "My father. He was the silent investor you tried to bankrupt, but he was smarter than you gave him credit for. This isn't revenge, Richard. It's just a long overdue accounting." I turned to the rest of the board. "The stock is down 30% because the market knows this company has no leadership and no future collection. As of this moment, Richard and Stephanie Vanguard are removed from all executive positions and banned from the premises. This isn't a family business anymore. The Vanguard era is over. My era begins now." Richard collapsed back into his leather chair, the silence in the room finally matching the coldness of the glass tower. The office I had just claimed still held the faint scent of Richard's expensive cigars and the lingering weight of a legacy built on stolen time. I wasn't there to admire the view or enjoy the leather chair. I was there for the files. While Richard and Stephanie were likely in their Napa villa, trying to find a lawyer who would work for the promise of a future they no longer had, I was sitting with a team of forensic accountants. Richard thought I was just settling a personal score because of a few insults at a wedding. He thought this was about feelings. He was wrong. It was about the blood in the ledger. My lawyer, a man who finds more peace in a spreadsheet than in a conversation, handed me the original Vanguard partnership filing from 30 years ago. He pointed to a single line at the bottom of the document. There was my mother's name, Susan Hale. It was meant to be the document where she signed over her original designs, the very sketches that founded this company, to Richard for a nominal fee of $1. I looked at the signature for less than 3 seconds before I felt a cold surge of certainty. My mother has spent 40 years holding a needle she doesn't write with a fluid, sweeping curves of a practiced executive. She writes in tight, careful letters, a habit born from years of precision. "It's a forgery," I said. My voice was clinical, devoid of the anger I expected to feel. Richard hadn't just bullied my mother. He had erased her from the very history he used to justify his wealth. He had stolen her intellectual property before I was even born, and then had the audacity to call her a mistake in the house her talent built. But that was just the beginning. The deeper the accountants dug, the more the Vanguard empire looked like a hollowed-out tree. The real bombshell came 30 minutes later. To cover Connor's massive gambling debts and to fund the 204 guests at that lavish multi-million-dollar affair, Richard had done something truly desperate. He had reached into the employee pension fund. He had used the retirement security of over 400 workers as collateral for high-interest bridge loans. In the legal world, this is a violation of the Federal Employee Retirement Income Security Act, a crime that the government takes very seriously. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. This was a federal kill shot. Richard didn't just steal from me or my mother. He stole from the people who had given their lives to his company. $22 million was missing from the trust. He had mortgaged their future to buy his son a white gazebo and a lifestyle of unearned arrogance. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. The Vanguards had spent decades making us feel small, making us feel like we were the ones who didn't understand how the world worked. But as the pale morning light hit the mahogany desk, the truth was undeniable. They weren't sophisticated. They weren't refined. They were just common thieves in couture clothing. And I was done being the victim. I was the auditor now. The executive boardroom door didn't just open. It served as the entry point for the end of their world. Richard was already there, flanked by a phalanx of expensive lawyers who were looking at their watches because they knew the billable hours were the only thing left of value in this room. Stephanie sat next to him, her chin tilted at that familiar angle of unearned superiority, her neck draped in a diamond necklace that had probably been purchased with a loan against an employee's future. "Grace," Richard said, his voice trying to find its old authority but sounding more like a rattle. "We have prepared a separation agreement. You will sign it, you will hand over the remaining encryption keys, and you will disappear with a modest severance. If you don't, we will tie you up in litigation for the next decade." I didn't sit. I didn't even look at the chair. I walked to the head of the table, the spot Richard had occupied for 30 years. I placed the red folder containing the federal audit results and the 60% shareholder confirmation right in front of him. "The time for negotiations ended at 2 p.m. yesterday, Richard," I said. "As the majority owner of this company, I am not here to sign your agreement. I am here to serve you yours." One of the board members gasped as he scrolled through the digital copy on his tablet. The room went cold. Richard's lawyers leaned in, their professional masks finally slipping into looks of genuine alarm. "It is all here," I continued, my voice clinical. "The 30-year-old forgery of my mother's signature, the $22 million you siphoned from the pension fund to pay for Connor's gambling debts, and that $1.5 million party you called a wedding. The Department of Justice has already been notified of the federal violations regarding the employee retirement funds." Stephanie's face collapsed. The woman who had called my mother a mistake in address 2 days ago was suddenly a ghost of herself. She stood up, her hands trembling so hard she knocked over a glass of water. "Grace, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We are family. We can fix this. Don't do this to us. Connor, he has a future. Richard's health." She actually walked around the table and reached for my hand. I stepped back. The invisible chains were gone. I wasn't looking at a powerful matriarch. I was looking at a common thief. "You aren't family, Stephanie," I said. "You are an overdraft, and I am here to close the account." Richard tried to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at the folder like it was a live grenade. "Security," I called out, and the 2 men I had hired from an independent firm stepped into the room. "Please escort Mr. and Mrs. Vanguard and their son from the building. They are permitted to take only what they brought in. And since the jewelry Stephanie is wearing was purchased with embezzled company funds, she will be leaving that behind as well." The finisher hit her harder than any insult. Stephanie reached for her necklace, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and pure, unfiltered terror. "You said my mother was a mistake in address," I said, leaning over the table until I was inches from her face. "But the only mistake was thinking you could build an empire on her blood, and then expect me to pay for the privilege. Goodbye, Stephanie." The security guards moved in. There was no shouting, just the sound of 2 people who had spent their lives at the top being quietly led toward the service elevator. As the door shut, I looked down at the mahogany table. This wasn't a victory. It was just a balance sheet that finally made sense. 6 months later, the glass tower in San Francisco no longer bears the Vanguard name. We took down the steel letters and replaced them with a simple, elegant sign that reads Susan's Atelier. This wasn't just a rebrand, it was a restoration. I used the $22 million recovered from Richard's offshore accounts to fully restore the employee pension fund. I didn't do it for the good press. I did it because the ledger needed to be balanced. Dignity isn't an asset you can trade, it's the foundation everything else is built on. We officially launched the L Foundation yesterday. It's an organization dedicated to providing legal protection and financial grants to independent artisans whose work has been exploited by corporate vultures. I want to make sure the next woman with a needle and a dream has a shield that Richard Vanguard can't pierce. Today, I am in Napa Valley, but I'm not at a white gazebo surrounded by 204 strangers. I'm sitting on the porch of the villa Richard tried to mortgage to pay for his son's gambling debts. It's mine now. I bought it during the liquidation sale for a fraction of its legacy value. The air out here smells like rain and possibility, not expensive perfume and lies. My mother is sitting across from me, her ivory lace dress long replaced by a comfortable linen shirt. She's working on a new piece, her hands moving with a grace that no high fashion school could ever teach. I watched her for a long time, realizing the truth about the people we left behind. I call it the power illusion of an empty wallet. Richard and Stephanie didn't just lose their money, they lost their existence. Because they never spent a day being something, they only focused on having things. Their status was a costume they rented with embezzled funds. The moment the cash vanished, the person inside the couture suit evaporated. They were never giants, they were just shadows cast by a pile of stolen money. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a flicker of regret for their downfall, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a tragedy, it was accounting. My mother looked up from her embroidery and smiled a real smile that reached her eyes. "You know, Grace," she said softly, her needle never stopping. "I used to think we were small because we had so little. But standing here, owning the very ground they used to look down on us from, I realized we were always the ones with the weight." I nodded, leaning back as the sun dipped below the vineyard hills. "Dignity doesn't have a price tag, Mom," I said, "but it definitely has a destination. If you believe that kindness and intelligence will always win against arrogance, please hit like and share this story. Justice might arrive late, but it never misses its flight. Subscribe to see more journeys of strength and quiet retribution. Thank you for walking this path with me.